I do want to start with that Chomsky Ukraine story because the outrage over his comments are just really, they kind of blow my mind. And I think people who support Chomsky and seem to be disappointed by his position on Ukraine seem to both kind of like not actually be listening to everything he's saying. So what'll happen is a press outlet will take, handpick one quote of his, and then people get the wrong idea about his overall position. And I also just want to point out really quickly, you guys, that Noam Chomsky is widely considered to be one of the most influential intellectuals of his generation. And yet, do you ever see him paraded up on cable news? No, of course not. They only ever care what he has to say when he says we should vote for Joe Biden or something. Okay. That's the only time they will ever show you what Noam Chomsky has to say. When he's criticizing what we've done in the Middle East, when he's criticizing Israel, they won't bring you any of that, right? It's only when there's a chance to create outrage or controversy that they can profit off of, or when he is towing an establishment line that any mainstream outlets will care to show you what Noam Chomsky has to say. Okay, so I wanted to show you the quote that's been making the rounds here. This is in the Jerusalem Post. They titled this "Noam Chomsky, Ukraine must make concessions to Russia's demands." And that's how this is all being framed. That's why I chose the Jerusalem Post here to show you guys, is because this is how this is all being framed. And I want to kind of debunk that a little bit. The quote in question, quote, "One option is to pursue the policy we are now following, to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. And yes, we can pursue that policy with the possibility of nuclear war, or we can face the reality that the only alternative is a diplomatic settlement, which will be ugly. It will give Putin and his narrow circle an escape hatch," Chomsky said. "We know the basic framework is neutralization of Ukraine, some kind of accommodation for the Donbas region with a high level of autonomy, maybe within some federal structure in Ukraine, and recognizing that, like it or not, Crimea is not on the table," continued Chomsky. "You may not like it. You may not like the fact that there's a hurricane coming tomorrow, but you can't stop it by saying, 'I don't like hurricanes,' or 'I don't recognize hurricanes.'" Listen, guys, that's just spot on. Okay. You can be in your feels about him not being harsh enough on Putin or something, but that's just spot on. He's telling it like it is. And he went on, by the way, this was in an interview with the Intercept, and Jeremy Scahill of the Intercept, and he went on at one point to say something about, he said there's only two ways that you can end a war, that we've ever ended a war in the history of mankind. There's two ways you can end a war. Either one side is basically completely eliminated, right? So destroyed that there is so little left that they lose power over the land that they previously had. Or you come to some sort of negotiated settlement. Those are the only two options. Now, we know in this situation that Ukraine is not capable of destroying Russia. So if you want to go that first route, there's only one country that's going to get destroyed. So we're either going to end this conflict with Ukraine being completely and utterly destroyed to the last Ukrainian, right? Or we can try to come to some sort of negotiated settlement. And I think people are taking Chomsky's acknowledgement of that reality as some sort of endorsement of Putin's actions. And I just really, again, want to encourage the audience to like two things can be true at the same time. Okay. So, there's a lot to dive into here. From the United States perspective, it seems pretty obvious to me that what we have tried to do is escalate this situation and keep that war hot, because it's geopolitically expedient for us to essentially use Ukraine to engage in a proxy war with Russia. And it's also very convenient for the military contractors and weapons manufacturers who get to make massive contracts off of this stuff, increase their profits off of these conflicts, wars, invasions, tensions, etc. So from the United States position, we kind of have tried to play good Samaritan, as though we're just here to help out the poor Ukrainians. And yet what we've actually done is pump more weapons into the situation, right? And Chomsky also, this is a point where I disagree with him. Chomsky said that he actually supports that. He said he doesn't see a problem with support, giving weapons and support to Ukraine for them to defend themselves. Okay, that's a point where I disagree with Chomsky, because I think it's escalatory. And again, to the initial point that was in that quote, there are two options here. So and no one's gonna like the outcome, you guys. Like when you have this kind of conflict and you come to a negotiated settlement, nobody's fucking happy. But the alternative is fight to the last Ukrainian and they all fucking die. So when that's the alternative, how is it like outlandish to acknowledge, hey, maybe we should try to come to a peace deal here. Maybe our efforts should be in diplomacy instead of in pumping more weapons into a situation. I do not understand the outrage here. I really don't, you guys. Well, I do in a sense, because the media has so programmed us just to viscerally respond to these things and do sort of the red baiting and, you know what I mean, the McCarthyism, all that kind of stuff. They've so convinced us that Russia is this unique evil that we must stop. And so many people do not know the actual context here. The NATO expansion, the 2014 coup, the civil war for nearly 8 years that's been going on in the eastern regions of Ukraine. People don't even know the basics of the background here, right? So they engage in the false dichotomy that I know my viewers probably get tired of hearing me talk about, but I see so much of it in how people view the world. We think of it as like it's fucking Marvel. There's a good guy and a bad guy, right? Zelensky's the good guy and Putin's the bad guy. That's not a reasonable or rational way to view the world. You're not going to get anywhere viewing the world like that. And by the way, Zelensky's not a good guy. This is another point I disagree with Chomsky on. He said, you know, like something about, I'm paraphrasing at this point, and I don't want to misquote him, but it was something about like, I sympathize with Zelensky's position. Now I can sort of sympathize with like having to deal with an invasion, but Zelenskyy is part of the government that was installed by the United States in 2014. He's like a right-wing corrupt maniac. So that one can sympathize with a position without going as far as saying he's a good guy. But in the United States, it's just Zelenskyy good, Putin bad. And that's how everybody views the conflict. And I think that's why when Chomsky acknowledges some of these realities, it breaks people's brains and they get really fucking upset. So as far as like what's actually up to date in Ukraine, it seems like the focus is back on the eastern regions. Russia has pumped more troops in, and Ukraine does not seem to be backing down. The negotiations don't seem to be really getting anywhere, quite frankly. So the longer this drags on, you guys, the worse it is for all parties involved, really. I mean, death all around, right? Russian troops are going to keep dying. Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian troops are going to keep dying. But who's it good for? It's good for NATO geopolitically because they get to fight a proxy war with Russia through Ukraine. It's good for NATO and the United States geopolitically, outside of all the resource stuff with Europe. And it's also very good for weapons manufacturers and military contractors. And I think all too often, if you just follow the money, you get a pretty good idea of what the actual incentives for our decision making are. So anyway, I'm really kind of fascinated by the extent of this outrage towards Chomsky, right? And you know, I wanted to make sure to kind of cover that. And I also I know I noted this at the start, but I want to note it again, you guys. You only ever hear what Chomsky has to say when there is a convenient reason for the mainstream press to bring it up. Noam Chomsky is never brought up on mainstream outlets. He's just never, you never see him interviewed on CNN or MSNBC, right? You never see him interviewed for like the New York Times or anything like that. It's the Intercept and it's Democracy Now! These are the outlets that will have Noam Chomsky on, not the mainstream. So it's just interesting to me. As soon as he says, you know, I think Trump's scary enough, you should vote for Biden, then everyone, oh, Chomsky says vote for Biden, right? But when he's criticizing the United States foreign policy or calling out the war crimes that Israel's committing, which we're going to get into today, then it's no, nobody needs to hear from this guy, right?